Hello and welcome to Eras and Icons. My name is Clarissa Schuler. I'm your host, and today I am so honored to be joined by Dr. Paul Kengor. A quick intro to Dr. Kengor. He is a professor of political science here at Grove City College. He's also the senior director of the Institute for Faith and Freedom, which is also at Grove City College. He's the editor at the American Spectator, which is a magazine located in DC, a conservative magazine. And he's also a best-selling author. He's written over 20 books on various subjects ranging from Karl Marx, who we'll be talking about today, to Ronald Reagan and even Hillary Clinton. So, Dr. Kengor, it's great to have you on the show today.
Thank you, Clarissa. Eras and Icons. I love the title.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, today we're talking about Karl Marx, and I thought it would be a fun idea to talk about what initially got you started on researching Marx and researching Marxism as an ideology.
Yeah, wow. Well, it started with my college years, so like you. And I was an undergraduate at University of Pittsburgh, late 1980s, and I was actually a pre-med at that point. And I was completely apolitical, totally non-ideological. Didn't know what a conservative was, didn't know what a liberal was, didn't know if I was a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. Had absolutely no idea. And I was working for Dr. Thomas Starzl, who was the guy who pioneered organ transplantations. So I did that from 1987 to 1991, kind of part-time while I was in college, 87 to 90, although I would work like full-time in the summers. And then when I graduated from Pitt in May of 1990, I worked full-time for about a year and a half for the transplant team. So anyway, but if you look at the era, all right, no pun intended there, but the late 80s, 1988, 89, that's when the Berlin Wall fell. We just talked about this today in class,
we did.
right? So poli-sci, 333 major European governments. We talked about the Berlin Wall today. And it was the end of the Cold War. All this fascinating stuff was going on in the world around me. And you'd have to be like brain dead not to be interested in what was going on.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah. So I became really intrigued by these great historical events. Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, Pope John Paul II, Václav Havel, the leader of the Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia, Lech Walesa, the Solidarity Movement. And I was just intrigued by all of it. And then as I started to really dig into it to try to understand it, doing what a science major would do, right? Doing research, trying to really look at things objectively, which is what I found out in the world of politics and ideology that doesn't always happen. But like for a science major, I was a biophysics major. If you've got a question, you go in a lab and you put the solution in the tube and you kind of shake it up and, oh, it turned orange. Okay, well, it's that. Or you look under a microscope, right? We would do this in the lab at Children's Hospital. You just start counting the platelets with this little counter, right? You check your pulse. You get the number. Very scientific. And I found out that politics doesn't work that way.
It does not.
No, I mean, people often make judgments and beliefs based on their emotions, how they want to see the world. And we had these people on campus called liberals, and at the time I really didn't even know what they were all about. But if you disagreed with them on something like Reagan or whatever, they called you all these hideous names and just attacked you. Call it fascist, Nazi. I'll never forget, I started writing for the school newspaper, the Pitt News, which was a daily paper. So we published.
You were the editor too, right?
I was, yeah. I was the editorial page editor, and my future wife was the copy editor, by the way. So this is
adorable.
So this is where I met her. But I started the first column that I wrote for the paper. I wrote on homelessness. Okay. And I was trying to figure out. Again, these people on campus who were blaming the homeless problem on Reagan, and I thought, well, how's this the problem of Reagan? I talked to these homeless people, right? And by the way, meanwhile, the liberals would make fun of these homeless people that they claimed to care about. And so I did some research on it, called a local homeless shelter, did all this different research. And at the end of my conversation with the lady who ran the homeless shelter, I said, okay, all right, I get it. I got it, this and this. So how is this Reagan's fault? She said, Reagan's fault? Young man, I don't know what they're teaching you at that college, but these people are mentally ill. This has nothing to do with Ronald Reagan, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, all right. So I put all of this in my article. It actually started as a letter to the editor.
Oh, wow.
So I sent the letter in. In those days, it wouldn't have been email. I don't even know how I did it. I must have typed it on my roommate, Mike Duckworth's electric typewriter or something. I don't know. And I sent it in, and the editorial page editor, who, by the way, was dating the copy editor.
Oh.
All right. So
Interesting.
And so he said, "This is really great. I'd like to run this as an article." I said, "Wow, really? Okay, great. Well, that's pretty cool." So it runs in the paper, and then all of a sudden, letters to the editor pour in, calling me racist, all these other. I'm like, what did I mention? Race,
Racist, fascist.
Yeah,
all this,
the homeless people we're talking about, and including this bag lady they all made fun of. She was white, right? I'm like, why are they calling me all these names? So I wrote that, and then I told the editor. He said, "Would you like to write another piece?" Probably thinking I'd be afraid to. I'm like, "Yeah, I want to write another piece." So I wrote a piece on arming the Contras in Nicaragua. This was about the Cold War, communism.
Yeah.
And I made the argument that you should want to arm these people. So then I get called a Nazi and a fascist. I remember my dad picking me up on a Friday to bring me home. We lived in Butler. I was raised in Butler. And he said, I can still picture him driving Clarissa, right? "Hey, how's that newspaper column going that you're working on?" "Oh, it's pretty cool, Dad. Yeah, really, really interesting. However, I got called a Nazi." And he, "A what? A Nazi? A Nazi? What are you writing about, Hitler?" And I said, "No, I'm not writing about Hitler. If I was writing about Hitler, it wouldn't be positive, right?" And he said, "A Nazi?" I said, "Dad, there's these people on campus. They call themselves liberals. I'm discovering this, right? And if you disagree with them, they call you every name in the book, everything. They just smear you and call you, even if you're not, writing about the subject." He's like, "A Nazi?" I said, "Yeah, Nazi. A fascist?" "Yeah, fascist."
So that article that you wrote during like the Cold War era, do you think that is kind of what like propelled you into studying like Marxism and communism as a whole?
This got me interested. So I started doing research. I started writing columns, and I became this like popular columnist, right? I was like, kind of like, the William F. Buckley Jr. of the Pitt News. Actually, my favorite columnist, there was another conservative columnist named Mario Olivero. Our favorite columnist was R.M. Material Jr., the editor of the American Spectator, which is really cool because now he's one of my best friends.
That's awesome.
And he's my boss at American Spectator, and I'm his successor at American Spectator. So that's a really cool thing. But so I started writing other columns on other topics dealing with the issue of the day, which was the collapse of communism. And so I would be, the night before my genetics exam, I would be in the library reading old copies of old newspapers about the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Blockade. And all of a sudden I realized, this is really academically what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Because the academic work, biochem, biophysics, the courses were agony. I mean, they were just
They're
awful.
agony for me too, trust me.
It was, I was learning completely worthless, useless stuff that had nothing to do with the study of medicine. The calc exams, nothing to do with medicine. And then I would go to my job for the transplant team. It was Presbyterian University Hospital and Children's Hospital. They were connected. And my office was at Falk Clinic. And I loved that work. It was fascinating. I loved it. And then I go in to take my courses, and it's just like, give me red hot pokers to just gouge in my eyeballs right now. Oh,
I know that's exactly how I would feel with science courses as well, being a political science major myself. But I mean, thank God you figured out your true passion and were able to pursue that more. Now with communism and studying Marx, I mean, how far you've come from writing all articles and columns in your newspaper all the way to writing The Devil and Karl Marx recently, which was such an amazing book.
Well, so I started taking some poli-sci courses, and I would crush those. I mean, I would get like a perfect score in every class. And meanwhile, I'm taking genetics for the third time and flunking it again, right? Trying to figure out these silly little things. And I thought, well, maybe that's what I had to major in. So I kind of split my two majors in my senior year. And I talked to my boss at the organ transplant team, Sandy Staszczyk, who was wonderful. And I said, hey, I know you've been holding this job for me when I graduate. If I get my degree in political science rather than biochem, biophysics, or microbiology. I had that as like a major too. Would you still hire me for the position? She said, absolutely. You've done a great job.
Oh,
You know this
awesome.
better than anybody. And I said, well, I'm going to get the science degree too, right? But I think right now I'm meeting, and she's like, well, wait and see. Which for her, I mean, she was a hard-driving, tough lady from Ambridge, PA, like the daughter of a steel worker, and she was usually really, it's like unusually sweet. but I loved her. We got along great, and in a very motherly way. Like, well, if that's what you want to do, wait and see. So I never did get that other degree, although I got minors in those subjects. And I applied to graduate school. Dr. Starzl wrote me recommendations. This was a weird thing. If I was applying to medical school, I would have gotten in anywhere in the world on his recommendations. But because I was applying to international relations, foreign policy, and national security, hardly anybody I was applying to knew who he was.
Yeah.
So his recommendations didn't carry as much weight. But I got into American University, School of International Service in D.C., which was a really good program. And I got there and started formally studying the Cold War, communism, end of the Cold War. Even then, the first time that I read the Communist Manifesto was when I was completely out of school.
Yeah.
And did so on my own. And as I complain about in classes, right, you could take a course on Marxism at a lot of colleges and never actually read the manifesto. Not here, folks, right?
True.
You teach it here. If I teach it here, we actually read the book. So I just, as part of the Cold War, I tried to learn everything about communism, Marxism, and that eventually brought me to did my first few books on Reagan into the Cold War, and then did books on communism, Cold War, Karl Marx. I eventually did, I think you mentioned The Devil and Karl Marx. And when was that, 2020, 2021, something like that? So now I've done, I don't know, a couple dozen books, and probably half of them deal with communism, Cold War, Reagan, Karl Marx.
Yeah.
There
and
you
that's perfect. Thank you for that
The rest
outline
is
of
history.
that. Yeah, the rest is history. But now that we've talked about kind of what led you to write all these books, I would like to talk about Karl Marx like as an individual. I think it's important to look at him as an individual before we look at his ideologies, which kind of makes me wonder, like, what was his early childhood like? What was his family life like? And I know we've talked about this a bit in Marxism, which is a class offered here at Grove City, but some of our viewers haven't heard all of these details about his life that are honestly so important to know when you're looking at his ideologies.
Right, yeah, he had, so in his own home growing up, so he was born May 1818 in Trier, Germany, and had pretty good parents. They were Jewish, although the father converted to Christianity, a sincere conversion to Christianity, became a Lutheran in the city of Trier, which was largely Roman Catholic. In fact, they grew up in the shadow of the great cathedral of Trier, which was built by St. Helena, the mother of Constantine, of all people. It goes back to the 300s. So the father became a Christian, and then Karl Marx was baptized about the age of 5. 1823, roughly 1823, 1824. Marx became a Christian himself and through high school, and then in college, that's when he left the faith.
Yeah.
Came under the influence of this kind of rabidly anti-Christian, anti-Semitic professor. He ends up being anti-Semitic himself, Marx, which is kind of hard to imagine an anti-Semitic Jew, but his statements about Jews are just shocking. I mean, they're really, really awful. As were his statements about blacks. I mean, just horrible stuff. So he leaves the faith that he grew up with, and then got married, had kids of his own, and did a really terrible job as a father, putting a roof over their head. He really didn't do it. In fact, the only way that he provided for them at all was through his parents' inheritance, and then they cut him off. Then his wife Jenny's parents, then they cut him off, and then through Jenny's relatives, they cut him off. Then the family of Jenny lent the Marx family the family nursemaid, Helen Demuth, known as Lenchen. Marx didn't pay her anything. She was like an indentured servant. Marx got her pregnant behind his wife's back. Marx refused to acknowledge that the kid was his. They named him after Friedrich Engels, called him Freddie. So Engels kind of tried to bail Marx out. And speaking of Engels, what really got Marx and the family through everything was Engels' inheritance from his family's, from his kind of wealthy industrialist father. It's all very ironic, too, because the 10 points of the Communist Manifesto, Point 3 calls for abolition of all right of inheritance. And in fact, these guys totally lived off of everybody's
Yeah, they
inheritance.
needed that inheritance or they wouldn't have had anything.
Exactly. And it's
Yeah.
typical of Marxists that they create these rules for everybody else rather than themselves, right? As I say in class, Marxism is for the ruled, not the rulers, right?
Yeah.
But he was, so he had a bad family life. He was not a good father. He was not a good husband. And he didn't have faith in anything other than himself. And as I know in The Devil and Karl Marx, he had this really perverse, kind of depraved fascination with Lucifer, with the devil.
Yeah. Something interesting about that, I was doing some research. It looks like when he started writing all of his like weird, creepy poetry, he started writing that poem about Lucifer and then also the one about the player. And it looks like he wrote those when he was in like his early 20s. That would have been his college years. And I just thought that was crazy because I'm in my 20s. And so
not writing poems about Lucifer?
I'm not writing any poems, but especially not about Lucifer. But I did want to talk about those a little bit, like his infatuation with all of this creepy stuff that kind of leads up to like his other writings, like the Manifesto, the Jewish question that you sort of brought up earlier,
right.
like how all of his writings sort of intertwined, but especially the infatuation with the devil.
Yeah, and he wrote a number of those things into the 1840s, which was when he did his Opiate of the Masses essay. That was 1843. The Communist Manifesto was published in February 1848. So a lot of those plays, right, The Player, The Pale Maiden, which sound like, kind of a late night B-movie horror flick, right? The pale woman who's walking looks like a ghost, and he's talking about suicide, suicide pacts, and he himself in the form of the devil. I shall howl gigantic curses at mankind. He had a favorite verse from, if someone asked you for a favorite quote, you might cite a scripture verse or a quote from a saint or somebody. Marx's was from the Mephistopheles character in Goethe's Faust. Mephistopheles is the devil, the demon character. And the line is, everything that exists deserves to perish. And that really sums up Marx, right?
Yeah.
Everything that exists deserves to perish. And they say at the end of the Communist Manifesto, so it's not just in Marx's own writings and statements, but in the manifesto, the final paragraph talks about the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions.
Yeah.
And it says in the book, communism represents the most radical rupture in traditional relations and traditional ideas. So for people who think that, oh, this is just about sharing and helping your fellow man, no. Read the book. The book's like 50 pages long. It's not even long. Read it and see what it actually says. It talks about abolition, criticism, overthrow, conquest, destruction. It was the most radical book ever written up to that point, which is why everybody in Europe had their eyes on the Marxists and were afraid of them because they realized how destructive they were.
Yeah, I mean, it lays out a 10-point plan for like the forcible overthrow, a revolution that was going to change everything. Now,
abolition of the family, religion, all morality. They have, if you were to look at, if you get an online edition of the Communist Manifesto, just go to like Marxist.org and type in like ABOLI, right? Abolish, abolition, and look at all the hits you get on that word. Look at all the things that they want to abolish. So the idea, everything that exists deserves to perish, the Mephistopheles character, that's the essence of Marxism. People who think, well, what are you against? Sharing, helping the working class? You have no idea what you're talking about. Read the book, right? Read the book. It's not about that. It's about the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions as they tell you in the book itself.
Yeah, that being said, thinking about Marxism in effect, we sometimes hear arguments about how communism or the Communist Manifesto has never really been like fully tried the way that Marx envisioned it. So I was wondering, what type of government did Marx envision and how would that have like played out? Because we see how it affected people like Lenin, and we can talk about that a bit later, but I'm sort of wondering what sort of government were Marx and Engels like envisioning and hoping for?
Well, I think the better way to go about it is just look at the specific things that they call for, right? And that's a better way to get to it. Because if you go through, like, for example, the 10-point plan, right, abolition of property and land, point one, and before that, they say the entire communist theory may be summed up in the single sentence, abolition of private property. And then they double down on that. They say, you are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. And then they don't say, well, that's not really what we mean. They say, precisely so. That is exactly what we intend to do. Now, right then and there, I don't know what government you're going to set up. Right. By the way, Lenin read this and said, okay, what we need is like a cadre of revolutionaries, of people in his article, What is to be Done, right? He figures out, all right, you're going to need somebody, a group to do this.
Yeah, the vanguard, right?
Right, the vanguard, the vanguard of the vanguard of the revolution. So if you're going to abolish all private property, that tells you right away the type of government you're going to need. And they start the beginning of the 10-point plan by saying, of course, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads. So you need a despotism. You need a despotic government. You need a tyranny. Then they talk about abolition of all right of inheritance. How are you going to do that peacefully? Abolition of this, abolition of that. My favorite is point 8 on, I mean, this one's really wild. You've heard this diatribe from me before. They call for the gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country. Now pause right there, right? Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country? All right. Okay, how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
And then they say, by a more equitable distribution of the population across the countryside. Now, I don't care what kind of a theorist you are, all right? Stop and think and be a practical-minded person for a second and think about a more equitable distribution of the population across the country. How are you going to do that? You're obviously going to have to then empty out people from the cities because they're calling for a gradual abolition between the distinction between town and country. You have to move people out of the towns, out into the country, presumably take all the liberals and progressives and pro-socialist and pro-Marxist types out of Manhattan, move them out into MAGA country, put them out in farm country, put them out in Omaha, put them around the Butler Farm showgrounds, right? Put them out there and more. By the way, the secret is, Clarissa, that those people, they know that they're not going to be redistributed because they're going to be in charge.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be
not
the
getting
managers.
sent to the
No, right.
the fields.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, Marxism is for the ruled, not the rulers, right? This will be for all of us slack-jawed morons, right? The rulers will get to work from their laptop in their coffee shop in Manhattan. This is for everybody else. But either way, if you just think about what Marx and Engels are saying there, you run into these Marxists all the time. The idea that Marx would approve of guns and gulags and violence is absurd. There was an article in that in the Wall Street Journal saying about how Marxism is for MAGA a couple weeks ago, February 2025. I know, it's crazy. It's by a professor from Lycoming College in Pennsylvania. Really? You don't think Marx is advocating for violence? What do you think it's going to take to abolish people's private property? To forcibly redistribute them into the countryside more equitably? What do you think it means to call for the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions? Does he need to put on the page, now in order to do this, we're going to need guns and gulags and a secret police? And he doesn't need to say it.
Yeah, it's kind of implied.
Right. Well, you're going to need force to forcibly overthrow all existing social conditions.
Yeah.
So come on, use your common sense.
Yeah, and I think we see this in effect specifically. I mean, last semester when we took Marxism, I remember talking about Cambodia and how communism functioned there, and even like the relocation between the cities and the towns and the fields. Like they forced people out of the cities into the towns and into these labor working camps. And I think that is sort of, obviously you can't say that that was Marx's idea to a pinpoint because Marx wasn't the person who did it,
Right.
but it was someone who was radicalized from his ideas that put that into
Well,
effect.
someone who opened Marx's book and said,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay, point 8. Okay, let's start." Right?
Yeah.
And so you look at the movie The Killing Fields, where they're being evacuated out of the capital, Phnom Penh, or Mao did this, Peking, Beijing. Emptying them out into the countryside, and for the kind of pro-Marxist who's like, "Why don't support that?" Well, read the book. I mean, what are they doing? They are forcibly moving people, abolishing the distinction between town and country by more equitably redistributing the population across the country. They're following the text.
Yeah.
They read it. You apparently didn't, because you just think it's a pretty good book if you just read it and never read it, right? Read it. They're following the rules.
Yeah. I think another point that's really interesting is I know in class we would often talk about how Marxism is sometimes grouped with Leninism, and we'll think of it as Marxism, Leninism.
Right.
And the ideas that he sort of added to it, like you were touching on with the vanguard and sort of the practical aspects of it, of needing that force and needing kind of the revolution to begin taking effect. And we saw that under Lenin.
And it's why it's typically called Marxism-Leninism.
Yeah.
Lenin believed that he was really kind of the one true interpreter of Marx, right? He was the one guy who got Marx right. And his document is called The State and Revolution, which was published, written about late summer 1917, about the time that the Bolsheviks took over, the Bolshevik Revolution. And he says in there things like, how do you define socialism? Well, socialism is the final transitionary step to communism. And he goes through and he's interpreting Marx and how to implement Marx. And Lenin understands, because Lenin at least had common sense, that when it says things like this, you're going to need people in charge with guns and gulags to be able to implement it, right? So this idea that, oh, Stalin, Mao, and the others are aberration. Marx would have never supported this. They're following Marx's ideas, which inevitably require, to quote Marx again, the forcible overthrow of things.
Yeah. And mentioning how socialism is the step before communism is actually a really great segue into our next point, because I want to kind of talk about the modern views on Marx and some common misconceptions, because I think a lot of times we'll see people advocating for things like democratic socialism or just socialism as a whole, and kind of saying that that's avoidant of communism and all of these like really harsh ideologies. But we see Marx actually addresses socialism as the step before communism. It's sort of on the road to getting to the communist utopia. Yeah,
Marx did, Engels did, Lenin did. And so the dialectic of history, right? Humanity would go through these different stages from slavery to feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism, right? So that was the final transitionary step. Now you'll run into people today who'll say, well, I'm a socialist, but I don't want communism. I'm a democratic socialist, right? And the number one group in America that's doing that is called the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America. That's the group that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a member of, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib. They have a half dozen members of Congress. By the way, they're all elected Democrats. I mean, they don't run for office as DSA candidates. They run for office as Democrats. And what they do is they go to Democrat-safe districts that are overwhelmingly Democrat. They target a more traditional kind of mainstream Democrat who they don't like and they see as a sellout. And they run against him in the primary. They defeat that Democrat. That's happened in the Pittsburgh area where I'm from. And they defeat that person, and then in the fall they run against a Republican, 80% registered Democrat. They win. They've got the seat. But they might be Democrats, but like James Carville says about Bernie Sanders, right? Bernie's not a Democrat. No, he's not. He's an independent. He's a socialist. Bernie supported the Socialist Workers' Party. They just run through the Democrats as like their Trojan horse, their vehicle to get elected. But if you go to the website of Democratic Socialists of America, they call themselves, quote, the largest socialist organization in the United States. And if you read their materials, it's very pro-Marxist. And take me up on this challenge, folks. Go to some of their chat rooms, go join some of their groups, their book clubs, There's a lot of Marxists with that group. And in fact, I often quote the convention statement from 2020, something like that. It referred to the 94,312 members of the DSA or whatever it was as comrades. So they actually called them comrades. And they sang the Communist Internationale at the opening, kind of like, we would with the Star Spangled Banner or something like that. So that's where the action is. They have 90-some thousand members. They have chapters on hundreds of campuses. Communist Party USA has only about 5,000 members. But the DSA is where the action is. They claim to be different types of socialists. But again, read the website, read the literature, talk to some of the people. A lot of them are very pro-communist.
Yeah, that's so interesting that they're like affirming Marxism, but not acknowledging the fact that Marx sees socialism as like a primary step to communism.
Yeah,
which is just crazy.
right.
Yeah.
But it's like anything else today where people start creating their own definitions of whatever they want on gender, on marriage, on whether or not a life in the womb is a life in the womb. So we're in this like postmodern world where once you let people on your side start to think that they can, come up with 100 different gender options, right? Beware of where this goes.
Yeah.
I mean, when words and definitions no longer have meaning, they can start changing the very essence of our understanding of words like communism and socialism. As you know, in the class, I would type up definition of socialism. It would typically say common ownership of the means of production. You get a pretty standard definition. Now it's kind of all over the place. Kind of like with the word insurrection, right? That all of a sudden was used to describe what happened on January 6th, right? So the people that control the stuff online will start tinkering with the definitions in a way to make it more palatable with whatever they want to do as part of their ideology or their revolution. I shouldn't even mention January 6th. But just the point of they can tinker with definitions online now to do things that they want to do in a way you couldn't do before when things weren't online.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about changing definitions and stuff like that, changing the meaning of things. One thing I wanted to ask about was we had talked about how some people will take religious aspects of the Christian faith and say that they are comparable, like, in Acts 2, they're advocating for Marxism.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to ask you about that as another common misconception, just real quickly, about how it's just so incompatible for religion and communism to coexist. And I think Lenin actually states that himself, but Marx very clearly agrees with that and believes that as well.
They all said it. Lenin, Bukharin, Michael Bakunin, Communism, Religion. Marx said communism begins where atheism begins. They all said communism and religion are incompatible. Communism and Christianity are incompatible. I mean, the idea to them that some religious left person in the year like 2020 something would say, oh, yeah, I could be a communist Christian. They would have said, you're out of your mind. Marx, communism begins where atheism begins. No, you can't be a communist and a Christian and a religious person. Are you crazy? But Acts 4:32, right, which talks about how they shared everything in common. People can look this up. I've written on that a number of times for Crisis Magazine. Maybe we could put this at the end of the video. I've written a couple pieces on this for the Institute for Faith and Freedom. But just because a community of Christians in the first century got together and shared proceeds of the private property that they possess, right? They had private property. It even says, read on in Acts, they sold some of what they owned and shared it. These are Christians living in community, right? This isn't an atheistic regime coming in and imposing upon an entire country like the USSR, which covered 10 to 12 time zones, right? Forcible abolition of religion, property, and everything else, and force people to redistribute this and spread out equally into the countryside. This is a group of Christians on their own by free will, motivated by their belief in God, not atheism, for their love of Christ, agreeing to help one another. To quote even Pope Francis, who gets accused of being, pro-socialist and everything, Francis said, that's not communism, that's Christianity.
Yep.
And keep in mind, that's from the first century. Communism comes in the 19th century. So just because communism might talk about sharing, you can't go like, oh, wow, communism talked about sharing just like the Gospels. The Gospels are just like communism. No, that's really dumb. I mean, that's
Yeah,
really
logical
simplistic.
fallacy there. Yeah.
That's just, no, they're nothing alike in any way. The early disciples in Acts 4:32, the early apostles, they're not talking about abolition of the family. They're not calling religion the opium of the masses. They're not rejecting religion, talking about all this other stuff. They're not talking about the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. No, these are completely different concepts.
Yeah. I think everything we've talked about today has been so telling about what Marx truly believed and what Marxism really is. So thinking about that, it's so crucial to know our history and know the true meanings behind all of these ideologies that are still very prevalent today. So thank you for sharing all of that.
Thank you, sure.
Now, what is
Good job.
one thing, thank you, what is one thing that you want our viewers to take away from this message on Marx?
Well, understand, like I said, first of all, that communism and religion are incompatible. I mean, so you occasionally see, again, religious left people say, we could learn from the No. The communists would have been the first to tell you that you're wrong on that. And, to quote, if I may, Pius XI's Quadragesimo Anno, to the extent that the socialists or communists have anything that you might in some way interpret as consistent or supportive of the gospel, I have an idea for you. Just follow the gospel, right? Just do what Jesus would do, WWJD, not what would Marx do.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about two completely different figures and ideas in every respect. You want to help your neighbor? You want to help the poor? Follow Jesus, right? Don't follow a anti-religious, anti-Christian ideology.
Yeah. Good word. Follow Jesus.
Follow Jesus.
Follow Jesus.
How's that for an ad?
Well, thank you, Dr. Kengor, for joining us.
All right,
if you guys want to hear more from Dr. Kengor, he's done a variety of podcasts and interviews. He's doing another one today. You can read what he's written at the American Spectator or through the Institute for Faith and Freedom or a variety of other sources. If you just look them up, you'll find a lot. So thank you again, Dr. Kengor. It was wonderful to have you.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right.